家晚安。Good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure. I'm standing here to present you Bill Statham. He's our friend. He's a very distinguished diplomat from the United States, retired. In his 34 years in the U.S. diplomacy, I think maybe people here know, maybe some of the people in my generation know the name Huang Lizhi. Have you heard of the name? He's a physicist who took a refugee in the U.S. Embassy during the Tiananmen事件, and Bill was there to help. And I noticed when I read Bill's career, I noticed you were in Lebanon when the terrorists bombed the building, killed many Marines. And also I noticed you were in the Pakistan, when there was Pakistan and India almost go to war due to the nuclear things. And anyway, I noticed in many parts of the world, I don't think it's coincidence. It's really when something happened, or your government sends you there. But
that's not true for Taiwan.
In 2009 till 2012, Bill is the director of the AIT, 就是在台协会，事实上就是等于美国派在台湾的大使。So he helped Taiwan in many ways, and one of the things I think is many people say when you go to the United States, you can directly, you don't need to go to the visa for a very complicated process, and that's Bill's, one of the Bill's contribution. And Bill, after he retired, he likes Taiwan. He stays in Taiwan. But in August the 1st, we have an honor to have him to become the NTU faculties. So now he has one courses open, and he's also helping us organize many of the interesting English lecture, English speech. So in my hand, I was looking at this, I was hoping he's also organizing this, the Ambassador Day. So he invites all the important ambassadors in Taiwan to come to NTU to give a speech. The first one will be given by it's a German, Mr. Martin Albers. The date to be announced. So there will be a lot of English activities, and we are hoping that the students and all the communities and friends, they can enjoy Bill's his very good experience in the diplomacy, and he has a great insight in many things. And but I have to say, he's a PhD in English literature. So saying the importance, students should work hard on the literature and other things. Don't always think of, I'm a physicist, don't always think of physics is everything. It's really the history, the art, and the language, I think is most important. And that's also something, 教务处 here, I'm really pushing. I have our students who have a good appreciation and opportunity to access to this art, literature, languages, and other things. And again, I really appreciate Bill come to help. So tonight he's going to give us his talk in his 我的美国外交官生涯. So it's a long career, and he'll give a very interesting insight in many things, and also tell you about his personal. I'm really honored and I'm so happy to stand here to present Bill. So thanks.
Thank you. 教务长给我那么好的介绍。As I learned Chinese when I was 39, that's when I started studying it, so it's a little bit cha. So, but a lot of my presentation I've tried, although I see this translation isn't precisely accurate, it may have been the translation was done before I finished the English title. But it's really going to try to be not only about what I did, but what I learned from what I did, because that's often more interesting than just the experience. And I've got a lot of pictures, and we've got a couple of newscasts along the way that may be interesting. You'll notice as I speak that I tend to spend more time on the early part of my career, as the provost mentioned. Early in my career, I was confronted with 5 years dealing with the Middle East, and the exposure to terrorism sort of changed my life. Another life-altering experience was living through the Tiananmen period in China when I was there during 87 to 90, and then seeing the changes when I went back to Beijing 95 to 98. And then finally, from places that were more difficult to serve in, my career took an upward turn, and I served as either the deputy or actually the acting ambassador in Australia, the deputy in Korea, in our embassy in Seoul, and then at AIT. So I went out on a high note. So those 3 aspects of my career, the terrorism part, the Tiananmen part, and the final 9 years of my career will get a little bit more attention than other things. I'm going to be talking about a lot of the challenges I faced, some of the achievements I think I contributed to, and then finally some, as I said, the lessons learned. Here I thought the fact of a boat falling over is an important one to remember, because you learn a lot from your mistakes in the course of your career. This is what a lot of my relatives, if they understood at all what the Department of State was, this is what they thought I was going to do when I said I was going to be a U.S. diplomat. They thought I would sit at a negotiation table and make decisions about the peace of the world or war. And my friends, they thought my life was going to be like this, that I was going to wear fine clothing, drink martinis, and be surrounded by beautiful women. And then, of course, this is what a lot of diplomats do too often. They sleep at their desks. They're not very active. They're in it for other reasons than the work itself. And generally, anything you do, the more you enjoy it, the more you want to do the work, the more you will enjoy it, the more that you'll accomplish. And this is what I thought I did. I was Captain America, and I was going to save the world. So there are different perspectives people have on what diplomats do. I think as near as I can tell from President Trump, he doesn't think they do anything worthwhile, and so he's cutting the State Department budget by 30%. Or he's trying to anyway. I was going to be an academic. What I really wanted to be was a writer. The first time I went to graduate school was because I got a free government fellowship for 3 years plus a stipend. And I lived all my life around New York City. I'd been born in Jersey City, and I could have gone to Columbia, but there were daily demonstrations by the Students for Democratic Society. And I was offered the same deal at Chapel Hill, and it was so beautiful and peaceful. I went there, and I kind of fell asleep for a few years before I finished my dissertation. But in that course of time, I didn't really think I wanted to be a professor, particularly after I had to teach a lot of freshman composition, and it was driving me crazy. But more than that, I wanted to be a writer, and I realized I didn't have very many stories. And I always tell my 2 daughters that it doesn't matter how much money you die with. What's great about life is if you die with a lot of stories, and you've been able to pass on and tell people, because that means you've led a rich life, a life full of experience. You've been to interesting places, done interesting things. So I always bore that in mind when I was looking for what to do. Was I going to have interesting stories? But to be frank, too, one reason was simply while I was finishing my dissertation, I was working at the university teaching hospital as a patient accounting supervisor, and I was making all of about $11,000 a year. And I had friends who were getting jobs in Midwestern universities, state universities, and they were getting offered $9,000. And when the State Department called, they offered me $13,000. And so there was no question, it was a lot more money. But the other thing is, now it's a lot easier to do research and writing because you have computers. But remember, in the days when I was doing a dissertation, I had thousands of pages of notes and note cards. Everything was done by hand and writing papers. I never really learned to type. I do it longhand and pay somebody to type the paper. So I was tired of just sitting in a library all day long and every night when I wasn't working. I wanted to do something more exciting. And as I said, I wanted to see more of the world, to experience more of life. And it struck me the more I learned about the Foreign Service, because when I took the exam, I didn't know what it was, believe it or not. I'd been a student in Germany during my third year in college and learned German, and then never used it again when I got back to America. But I never even had to get a visa, or that I was aware of. I mean, I guess I did get a stamp, but I didn't know what a visa was. I didn't know what an embassy was. I'd never been to a U.S. embassy, so I was pretty naive. And then as I got to know more about it, I said, this is great. I want to be a witness, if not a participant in history. And it was very exciting to me. Now, early on when I was doing training in Washington, I quickly figured out that there are two kinds of posts in general. It's everything I say will be a little bit exaggerated, but you can go to a beach in Costa Rica and you'll have a lovely existence. But frankly, Washington doesn't care that much about what happens in Costa Rica. It's one of the more pleasant places in Latin America. Or you can go to a war zone like this city in Africa. I forget what, I think it was in the Sudan, I'm not sure. But I figured out, talking to people, that if you went to places that were important to your government, and preferably dangerous places, you could advance more quickly. You might ask then, but why did I decide then to volunteer to go to Beirut? And why did I even have to volunteer? Because it was known as the Paris of the Middle East. It was really beautiful. But the fact is, and I lived along the Corniche when I finally got there, but when I got there, it looked like this. It was a war zone because there had been a civil war in 1975, 76, and fighting when I arrived in February of 79 was still going on. And the middle of the city was divided between Christian and Muslim sectors, and they were still shooting and sniping at one another. So there were only certain days when our spotters would tell us the snipers were not active and we could cross over. But that was downtown Beirut. And where all the plants, it's hard to see them, but it was called the Green Line because it was so vacated, so human life was so absent that it was turning into a forest there in the middle of the street. That used to be, I think, the Continental Hotel, and it was full of shell holes because a lot of snipers were using it. Okay, so why was it important to go to Lebanon back then? Well, why was the US government so interested? Well, at that time, just as now, the Russians were very active in Syria. And Russia supported the Syrian regime, which gave them military access. So even in those days, when you would go to some of the sites in Syria, like Palmyra, which I don't see here, they don't show the tourist spots anymore, or up to Aleppo, as we did, you would often see Russian troops and troop emplacements. But Beirut was a war-torn area, and the US position at the time, under President Reagan, was we were going to be supportive of Lebanon, a Western-oriented Arab state. But Lebanon was fraught with problems, not the least of which is that it's extremely divided, not only by religion, but by ethnic groups, And then also, ever since the early 70s, when the Palestinians were kicked out of Jordan, at least a lot of them, Palestinian Liberation Army was kicked out, a lot of the refugees, they settled in Lebanon. And they were an added source of friction. It was bad enough that the Sunnis and the Muslims and the Christians didn't get along. But on top of that, the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims didn't get along. And within the Christian community, the Armenians didn't get along with the Christian Maronites, and none of them got along with the Greek Orthodox. And to make it worse, the French, who created this along with the British at the end of World War I, when they drew the lines creating all these borders, they created a government which was based on confessionalism, on the assumption that the Christians were the majority, the president would be a Christian, the prime minister would be a Muslim, the speaker of the National Assembly would be a Shiite Muslim, and so forth. The minister of defense was a Greek Orthodox, and minister of finance was Greek Catholic. And of course, populations change, and the Muslims were having a lot more babies than the Christians were, and there was no correlation between the government power structure and who was in charge. And so it was total chaos. And it made it very interesting to be a political officer. In fact, it made it interesting my first year to be a visa officer, as I'll tell you. But the really precipitating event in the Civil War was there was a Palestinian refugee camp not too far from the Christians. And the Christians were occupying the upper side of Beirut. It was called East Beirut, as opposed to West Beirut, but it really on the map looks more north. But it was actually this area here. And there was a Palestinian camp, and one day one of the Christian militias decided to go in and kill everybody, or as many people as they could, and that precipitated the Civil War. Now, didn't mean there was always fighting going on. This was on some days, as I say, when you could cross over, because we were all located in West Beirut, in the Muslim part of town. You could get on the coastal road, and you could go up to the Roman ruins in Byblos, and you could have, Lebanese wine, which wasn't bad, fresh fish from the sea, and be a beautiful day. But often at night, from my apartment, I would see gunfire. Here they're using traces, so it probably means they're shooting at Israeli airplanes that would fly over. And while that may seem just colorful, with a lot of people who were shooting in the air, and they shot in the air for all kinds of reasons, if they wanted to go down the wrong way on a one-way street, sometimes they just start firing their Kalashnikovs and machine guns to get people out of the way. And sometimes, if they were happy, so their brother was getting married, they would shoot these guns in the air, and what they always forgot is what goes up comes down. And often people would get bullets right into the top of their heads. It was at a time when it was so crazy there that people obviously used to fish right off the coast from the road that ran along the sea, and they fish in their boats with dynamite. And they take the dynamite and they throw it in the water, and it would stun all the fish who would float to the top, and then they would net them. And sometimes they forget that they just lit one while they were throwing in another one, and it would explode and kill them. It used to happen with some frequency, oddly enough. Now, if I asked you, how do you know that this woman is a Christian? Could you tell me? The photo was taken, I checked it, in around 1981. How can you tell back then that she's a Christian? Anyone? Well, for one thing, she's wearing Western garb, and the Christians were very much under the influence of French. Just about everybody in Lebanon was multilingual. They all spoke, if they were Christians, they all spoke French, and some of the Muslims did. And everybody spoke Arabic, and if you're Armenian, you also spoke Armenian, and maybe Turkish as well. And all the educated people also spoke English, so it was smart. But the white tells you that, but also the flag. It's the national flag of Lebanon. And if you were a Muslim back then, it wasn't likely you would fly that flag. You would fly something that was altogether green, because that was a symbol of Islam. And of course, we have the bombed out building behind her, and it shows the spirit, in a way, of the Lebanese. This was our embassy at the time. And my first office was here when I was a visa officer. I was the only visa officer in a war zone. So as you can imagine, I had long lines every day. And after a year, they found out I could write pretty well. That's another advantage of studying English. And they moved me up to the political section. So keep this in mind. There was a balcony on the side of the building, and this was the view from it, out to the Corniche and the Mediterranean. This is an old photograph, and it's faded. The sea was often a beautiful blue. But keep in mind, because later I'll show an attack against the embassy, and it was brought on by a guy or guys in a car, and they just stopped here. And they got out and fired a rocket-propelled grenade. They did that more than once. One of the things I learned fast, and you don't have to read all this, I'll just tell you in general, that the ambassador before my ambassador had been assassinated, the American ambassador had been assassinated. He got into his car, and apparently he didn't know that his driver had been turned, and he and his economic counselor were driven to a place where they were killed. The econ counselor and the ambassador. The next ambassador was Ambassador Dean, and one day, because he lived up in the hills above Beirut, because he liked the view of the sea and the city, he and his French wife, they and their daughter and her boyfriend were in an armored car caravan. There were 3 or 4 cars, and they had to turn at a certain point to go down into Beirut. And when they turned, there are people, probably Christian phalange, because they later figured out that it was a US-made Law anti-tank rocket that was fired at the armored Cadillac, and we were able to trace it. It had actually been sold to the Israelis, so the Israelis were often supplying the Christian phalange with weapons. And they blew a crater just behind the car, because the guy got nervous and he fired too quickly, and he moved a little bit. Amazingly, no one was injured because they blew out a lot of the tires, but the car could still drive. And the interesting thing was, with all the guards with machine guns in the cars, there were only, apparently, as I recall, 3 shots that were fired, and that was simply when the car took off, because they were being fired on. He was jerked back, and the shots went out the window, so he didn't shoot at anybody. There was a second attempt. There was a night when, fortunately, no one was there because the Marine House was on the roof. 4 rockets landed on the roof of the embassy. Another rocket-propelled grenade, I mentioned that earlier. It actually blew up on the wire mesh of the window in the office next to mine when I was in the consular section. So the whole room, unfortunately, the door between our offices were closed. I was standing at my desk, and it covered that room with shrapnel. And for the first time in my life, I knew what it meant when people say your knees turn to jelly, because I suddenly couldn't stand up anymore from the shock of it. So another time, at a later date, they fired and blew up a rocket-propelled grenade, which blew up on the outside of the building, other attempts. And later on, the French ambassador was assassinated. Through all of this, we got danger pay, which was about 25% of our salaries. But, we never closed down the embassy. And one of the points I'm going to try to make is we all see what happened after 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I personally believe they were insane wars. But I think it's an after-reaction of years of terrorist attacks on us, when actually America didn't do anything. So I also learned things on the visa line. Everyone loves you if you're a visa officer. So as I used to tell later on when I was running an embassy, I used to tell the young people, don't confuse people liking you with people liking you because of your position. It's not the same thing. Don't get too big for your boots. Don't, for your shoes, make, they like you because of what you represent, not because of they particularly like you. Another thing I learned is that And that's particularly true in a war zone when everybody wants to get a visa to go away. Another thing I learned, which is a lesson for all gift-giving societies, was never to accept any gifts. And the security officer, when I arrived, I told him he wanted to know what my experience was. And the only thing that impressed him was when I told him I had worked for 4 months as a social worker in the very dangerous South Bronx of New York. He said, well, now you're talking. But he told me, because it was such a rough and tough place, he said, always remember, a lot of people who invite you to dinner, unless you can drink their wine and eat their food, and even occasionally go out with their daughters, and still say no to them, you shouldn't be here, you should leave. So, other lessons, any document could be forged. If there was a rumor on the street that you needed $40,000 US in the bank to get a visa, suddenly everybody was coming in with brand new accounts showing $40,000. I also learned that no one will ever complain if you issue a visa unless that turns out to be a visa. But we got hundreds of letters from senators and congressmen. Why didn't you give the cousin of my potential future constituent? That was actually a letter from Ted Kennedy when he was a senator. The cousin of my future constituent. In other words, there was a guy who was in his district who couldn't vote, but he wanted to bring his cousin, and he said you should give him a visa because he's going to be a future constituent. As I mentioned, if you write well in the Foreign Service, because diplomats have to write reports, they have to keep records of meetings, memoranda of conversation. If you write well and you write quickly, that's a real advantage if you're going to be a political officer. I also learned political lessons. One, as I already demonstrated in the map, religions and religious sects tend to divide societies. That's my own personal view. If you look at Nigeria, Sudan, both of which are divided between northern Muslim areas and southern Christian and animist areas, if you look at what's happening to the Muslims in Burma now, if you look at Pakistan, which broke off from India because one wanted to be Muslim and one wanted to be Hindu, or secular actually, and then look at the fighting that goes on to this day between Sunnis and Muslims in Pakistan, where I served. If you look at the Yugoslav wars and going back to the Crusades, I think, religion has not exactly been a unifying force in many countries, but I'm willing to listen to counter-arguments. And again, it was Western colonies that also often define these boundaries. Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon did not exist as countries until they were invented by two guys named Picot from France and Sykes from Britain in around 1920. They came up with a line, and that's why when you look at a map, of Syria, you see these straight lines in there because, it's an artificial border. So that's one of the reasons to this day, Iraq and Syria and Lebanon are still fraught with difficulties, Jordan as well. So now I decided after I left Lebanon, and there was so much war all the time, but I was a glutton for punishment and told me one of the most prestigious positions was to go to the operations center, which is a 24-hour-a-day operation that gets news and cables from all over the world, and you write up reports on a regular basis for principals, the key people in the State Department, to let them know what's going on. Now, I'll ask a question. How do you know that this wasn't when I returned to, when I got back to Washington in 1981? What's the giveaway that this was 1981? Anyone? What's unusual about these two pictures? If you can see them clearly enough. Well, you notice here there's no cars, even though there are parking spaces. And there's a police car. And here is a bollard, it actually looks like a planter. And if you look here, there are planters surrounding it. Well, this shows that it was after 9/11, because what they did is they wouldn't allow anybody to park anywhere near the State Department anymore. They also, including diplomats, they also surrounded the entire building with these heavy steel and concrete barricades that were made to look like they were there for the plants. So one of the things, though, is the perceptions are so different in Washington, because when you're overseas in a country, you feel immersed in that culture. So you always think that your colleagues back in Washington, they understand nothing at all. But their view, when they understand the policy limitations of Washington, because you have to act in accordance with what your president wants, even if he's nuts, you develop the idea that, the people in Washington, they're ignorant. They don't know what's going on here. So this is what the Operations Center did not look like. How do you know it didn't look like this when I was there? You know, because in 1981, they didn't have laptop computers in the State Department. Advanced, we were very happy. We were one of the first offices in the whole building to get Wang computers, word processors. That was so far behind the time, and there were still some around when Colin Powell came in as Secretary of State. And phones, we had push-button phones. That was considered very innovative, rather than the old dial phones. So we didn't have those things. A lot of it was still IBM Selectric, where it was a great advance when we could back up and erase the letter we just mistyped. But in any case, I was a watch officer and editor, and some of the key events when I was there was the Polish rebellion, which was crushed by the communist general Jaruzelski with the support of the Russians. Argentina's invasion of the Falkland Islands while I was on duty. We knew it was coming, of course, because we were close to the Brits. Terrorist incidents increased around the world, not only in Lebanon, including the first kidnapping of an American official in Europe, Brigadier General Dozier. These are the guys next to him, this group who captured him and then killed him. And then one of the big events was in June 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. And there were clashes with the Syrian troops, and there was continuing fighting for some time. I then, because of the work I did and because the Bureau of Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs, we covered everything from the Western Sahara all the way over to Bangladesh and India and Iran, Afghanistan, this whole area. It was a very big area, and remember, we didn't have computers in those days. So I was a staff assistant, so everything was produced in 5-ply printouts, whether it was news alerts, whether it was cables from overseas. And one of my highly intellectual jobs was to tear all those plies apart, staple each individual cable so I could distribute them to all the principals, then make copies for key offices that needed to receive them, and keep a record of what I'd given to everyone, particularly if it was sensitive. It was not much fun, but you were there at the center of the action, and you got to know the Assistant Secretary of State and work closely with him. While I was there, of course, this was just before I left. It was the invasion, as I said, and one of our jobs when I then was to try to get the Israelis out of Beirut before it was destroyed. To do that, we had to get the PLO out of their headquarters, and we finally achieved that. But in the course of all that, there were some terrible tragedies. There was the Sabra Shatila massacre, where, although the Israelis disputed, but as many as 35 dispute their role in this, but at least 35,000 civilians, 3,500 civilians, men, women, and children, were killed by Christian militias who were allowed to go into the camps and just shot everybody they saw. That was one of the reasons we wanted to get the Israelis out. David Dodge, he was the AUB president of American University of Beirut, and he was an Arabist. He spoke fluent Arabic. And this is when we really began to see how close the connection was between terrorist attacks against Americans and Iran. And this is one of the reasons there's such a difficult time to this day dealing with him, because he wound up being kept in a prison just outside of Tehran. And many of the other attacks against Americans were supported by the Iranians. They supported Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad in particular, gave them money and logistical support and weapons and explosives. He, fortunately, after a year of negotiations, we managed to get him out. Then, as I was preparing to take up the job as the Lebanon country officer, remember, this is what the embassy looked like. And then this is what happened.
In Beirut, Lebanon today, a pickup truck loaded with explosives drove to the American embassy, and there was a tremendous explosion.
Sorry. I want to make it louder, and I made it start it over. I'll put it down.
Jennings is in Beirut. Here.
David, this is the worst attack there has ever been against the United States and the Middle East. The explosion at 5 minutes past 1 this afternoon devastated the embassy here on the edge of the Mediterranean in West Beirut. At this late hour, we are told that more than 40 people are dead, between 80 and 100 wounded, Americans and Lebanese. Tonight, the Marines and the Lebanese are still searching for survivors, still trying to extricate bodies. An Islamic group calling itself Islamic Jihad, which means holy war, claims to have planted the explosive. The group, which says it has attacked the multinational force here before, of which little is known or understood, is believed to be pro-Iranian. Its aim today, so it said, to end American occupation of Lebanon. With me here in Beirut is ABC's Mike McCourt.
The embassy was reduced to a flaming shambles by the bomb, which according to Lebanese police was apparently packed in a pickup truck carrying false diplomatic license plates. The truck was reportedly allowed into a car park underneath the embassy building, where it exploded with a force that shook Beirut for blocks around. Within minutes, rescue workers were swarming onto the embassy property. President Reagan's special Middle East envoy, Philip Habib, and his deputy, Morris Draper, were not in the building at the time. They are safe. The 7-story embassy was occupied by about 200 American and Lebanese employees, many of whom were trapped in the wreckage of the North Wing, which collapsed. Ambassador Robert Dillon was caught for a time in the North Wing, but he escaped with minor cuts and bruises. Others were not as lucky. This man, a Lebanese, was taken out, badly burned and cut, but conscious. Many others were critically wounded by the force of the bomb, which police say contained well over 500 pounds of TNT. And for more than 40 people, according to those latest casualty reports, the bomb meant instant death. The carnage in and around the embassy was appalling. A dozen ambulances took the wounded to various Beirut hospitals. And as the casualty total increased, doctors in at least one hospital were forced to give emergency surgery in the lobby because there was no room anywhere else. Other victims were airlifted by helicopters to American and French hospital ships anchored in the port of Beirut. By tonight, the embassy had been totally sealed off. Rescuers were continuing their search for more victims who might still be alive under tons of collapsed cement, and for more bodies. Mike McCourt, ABC News, in Beirut.
So this is what it looked like thereafter. And some of the people I worked very closely with when I was in the consular section particularly were killed. One was an interesting guy. His name was Kamal, and he was interesting because he was Druze, and his wife was Greek Orthodox. And she spent days going from hospital to hospital hoping they would find him. And apparently he must have been right at the center of the explosion because they never found any remains other than his wedding band. So there were a lot of tragic stories. A young woman I had worked with in the consular section was badly scarred by shrapnel on her face. So, about the same time, a few months later, there was the U.S. Marine barracks was bombed. and 241 Marines, sailors, and soldiers were killed. The devastation was so great that this is what it had looked like. And the Marines were barracked there before it was blown up. It was around this time that I was sent back to Beirut, and I was working in the basement of the British Embassy, which was a temporary embassy, for about 3 weeks to help them because they were so badly staffed as a result of this event. This is about the same day as the U.S. Marine bombing. The French paratroopers' barracks were bombed, and 58 were killed here, and that's what the building looked like after the explosion. So I guess I was a glutton for punishment at that time, and I was building my career, and I agreed that I would be the country officer for Lebanon. And one of the first issues I was hit with was dealing with the families of the American hostages, because what they started doing was kidnapping people. This was the AP correspondent, Terry Anderson. This was Jeremy Weir for CNN. Jeremy Levin. This was Reverend Weir. He was a Brit who went out to negotiate with the kidnappers, and they kidnapped him. This was the American dean of this American University Beirut Agriculture School. This was Father Jenko, whose sons were in Peoria, Illinois, and they used to call me up drunk at night and say, "What have you done?" And I said, "Well, I'm still in the office, and it's 11 o'clock at night." And they would start crying through their beer because poor Father Jenko couldn't get out. And then this was Benjamin Weir. This was his wife who used to come in, and she was always saying all you had to do was change U.S. policy, and she knew her husband would be released. These were people who really were a bit indifferent to the dangers, as America in general was. I mean, when Terry Anderson was kidnapped, it was because he was wearing white tennis shorts and walking down for his weekly tennis game at the same time of the day. And he was picked up by a car. They threw him in the car, and he spent the next 6 or 7 years chained to a radiator. It became increasingly violent because, remember, the first president of AUB who was kidnapped, he eventually got freed. But this one who succeeded him, he was shot and killed just as he was leaving his office. They didn't bother to take him. And Islamic Jihad later claimed responsibility for that. The new U.S. Embassy, or the temporary location for one, which is now in Christian East Beirut, I don't know, I guess they weren't quite cautious enough still. And a suicide bomber managed to explode inside the main gate while he's speeding toward the main gate, 500 kilograms of high explosives. And still, even though he was stopped by the Lebanese guards who opened fire on him, it still exploded and it killed at least 20 people. You never know for sure, because you're not sure who might have been walking by and just was blown out of sight. There's a somewhat, if you like revenge movies, it was finally figured out fairly early on, actually, that it was a Shia family called the Maniac Family, who were responsible for a lot of the deaths, including the Marine barracks bombing, the U.S. Embassy bombing, the hostage taking, the assassination of Malcolm Kerr. That was actually this guy, the same guy in the TWA hijacking, and this is his picture here. The Israeli bombing attack in Buenos Aires. And according to the Washington Post, Munir was killed on February 12th, 2008, many years later, as a car detonated in Damascus as he was walking by. And according to the Washington Post, the CIA and Mossad had cooperated in his assassination. I don't know if that's true, but, it wouldn't surprise me, at least for the Mossad anyway. So what did I learn from all this? Well, I learned actually that all this went on. This was, remember, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85. And it wasn't until 2001 when they blew up the World Trade Center that suddenly people said, hey, we've got to pay attention to this. But in the interim, it was other events like the bombing of Pan Am 103, which was blown up. Mostly young American college kids returning from Europe for the Christmas holidays were blown up. The World Trade Center was bombed earlier in '93. They blew up a place where a lot of foreigners were living in Saudi Arabia, the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam, and of course a speedboat blew up and killed people in the USS Cole. Now, oddly enough though, the U.S. finally reacted in 2001, and we went to war. And we're still going to war, still to this day, in Iraq and in Afghanistan. But the thing to remember is that in all the years of terrorism, if you're looking at causes of death, it's only been a total of 3,412 people who were killed between 2001 and 2014. Obviously, there'd be more if you went back to my days in Lebanon. But most of them, nearly 3,000, were killed on 9/11. If you compare those numbers with the number of people, and that's worldwide, people killed. But if you look at the number of people killed by firearms in the United States, it comes to 440,000 plus. So in some ways, we were very slow to react, and then in my own personal view, I think we overreacted. And what we didn't necessarily address the problem. So lessons I learned, many things can upset people in leadership positions, but nothing is really important for the lives of people. Too often I saw principals, they were only upset if a newspaper had a bad story about what they'd done or not done. That goes all the way up to the top of the White House. They worry about sort of their public image and how they look to the public, but nothing is really important. And that's what diplomacy is all about, is saving the lives of people, about making peace and not war. So that was one of the things I learned. I also learned when, after the bombing of the barracks, we pulled out and I was enlisted to come in on a Sunday morning. In those days, when I was the country officer of Lebanon, I went one 7-month period working 7 days a week for 7 months. And I was told to write the letters telling President Mitterrand of France, Prime Minister Andreotti of Italy, and also Prime Minister Thatcher of England, because they were with us in the so-called multinational force, that we were going to redeploy offshore, which was a nice way of saying we were pulling out, we were gone. And to my surprise, when I drafted these first presidential letters of mine, they got approved without any changes. So it scared me that sometimes nothing stands between what you write and what people say. I also learned that constant stress is very bad for your health. So I also figured out by this time, and I think to this day I'm right, there's little hope the overall situation in the Middle East would improve. And I figured, and it's true to this day, that even many of the leaders or their family members remained in charge, whether Hussein, his son now in Jordan, or Assad, his father had been president of Syria, and now he is. The leadership in Saudi Arabia is the same royal family. So I made the best decision of my career. I figured that nothing was ever going to change politically, religiously, economically. The problems of the Middle East would not be solved during the course of my career or even in my lifetime. Therefore, get out of the Middle East. And then I said, well, go to Asia where there's growth, where there's change, where there's hope, where there's progress. And there usually aren't religious wars, although now we see one in Burma of a kind. But what I didn't know when I asked was how hard Chinese was going to be. And this is me studying at Yangmingshan for 10 months back then. Here I am with a mustache, still. And here I am in my happier days before Tiananmen in Beijing. When I first got to Beijing, in some ways, back in those days, in 87, 88, when the pollution wasn't blowing in from the ironworks in the west, and when the Gobi Desert sands weren't blowing, and when it wasn't winter and they were burning charcoal briquettes, the air was actually cleaner than here in Taipei. And there was no traffic because nobody owned any cars, so it was bicycles. So it was quiet and the streets are flat. It was a great place to ride a bicycle. So, and this was my little girl who'd been born in Taiwan, Taiyan Yuan, who now lives in Australia. The most dramatic thing that happened, though, were the demonstrations that went on for a month and a half, almost a month and 3 weeks in Beijing. They were unbelievable and exciting, and we were supposed to go out and sort of monitor them. And we had to be careful because we didn't want to in any way be seen as encouraging or supporting demonstrators, but we went out and asked them what their concerns were. And almost all of them were concerned about things like their pay, the inequality between what party leaders were able to obtain in terms of food and products. Their concerns were generally very down to earth. Some of them talked about democracy and liberty, but we thought it was all going to end very peacefully, and of course we encouraged the Chinese government that that would happen. And this is Wang Dan, who later came to Taiwan. This is Zhao Ziyang, who, because he supported students and didn't want to attack them, he wound up being under house arrest for the rest of his life. This was the goddess of liberty, which they hated because they reminded them of the Statue of Liberty, so they immediately tore it down when they took over. And then there was the initial night. The day before, I guess, we with another couple in their car, because we each had a baby in a back seat in a child seat. We were going out to the only place at that time where you could get pizza was at the Holiday Inn Hotel. And at that time, there were only 2 lanes going out to the airport. One was, only one going out, and there was one coming back. And we got to a certain point going to the airport, Holiday Inn Airport Hotel, and we couldn't go any further because on both sides of the road, there were troop carriers and tanks and APCs. And so we knew they were getting ready to move in, and indeed, that's what they did. And here, because I think many people...
The noise of gunfire rose from all over the center of Peking. It was unremitting. On the streets leading down to the main road to Tiananmen Square, furious people stared in disbelief at the glow in the sky, listening to the sound of shots. Heading down the road was a hazardous business, but hundreds of people cheered as buses were set alight and army trucks caught fire too. They yelled and shouted, and then as troop lorries were seen moving down the road, there was gunfire from those lorries. The troops have been firing indiscriminately, but still there are thousands of people on the streets who will not go back. The bicycle rickshaws scooped up the injured, others were shunted onto bikes and pedaled to hospital. Many were carried away by frantic local residents. There was confusion and despair among those who could hardly credit that their own army was firing wildly at them. Many were bystanders, perhaps naive about the savagery of the situation. Indeed, it was hard at times to grasp that this army was launching into an unarmed civilian population as if charging into battle. From Tiananmen Square, the sound of gunfire sounded like a battle, but it was one-sided. A line of soldiers were strung out facing a huge crowd. The air was filled with shouts of "Fascists! Stop killing!" We were in the line facing the troops. They were about 250 yards away. Young people were singing the Internationale to a background of gunfire. After hours of shooting, Square, we picked up a woman with a bullet in the head and took her to the nearby children's hospital, into a scene of near mayhem. Casualties were arriving every few seconds, on bikes, rickshaws, park benches, carried in, all with gunshot wounds, housewives, elderly residents, people shot while sitting in their homes. The operating theatre was overflowing, many of the staff in tears. In 20 minutes, 40 seriously injured were brought for emergency surgery. 2 were already dead. In the streets, many came up to us, shaking with anger and disbelief and fear. Many were terrified, saying there would be retribution. There was not one voice on the streets which did not express despair and rage. Tell the world, they said to us.
Anyway, because I went through that experience and saw a lot of that. We went out after the event. We did an estimate of casualties based on the bodies we saw in the hospitals until the authorities stopped us from doing that. I always think it's important to remind people because we forget of what an impact it had on many people and still has on me to this day. This was afterwards some of the tanks that were burned out. And anyway, there was also a subsequent incident which had us in a panic. All the foreigners in those days were required to live in Jianguomenwai, this housing compound. And we got a report, my wife and I, we were both working at the embassy, that there was a sniper firing. And then we realized as we got in the streets, traffic wasn't moving, so we ran from the embassy to the building, and then we couldn't get in. And the troops everywhere were running around like crazy. They're basically a lot of young, almost farmers, young boys from outer provinces. And they wouldn't let us in, but finally a friend of mine who had grown up in Taiwan and spoke flawless Chinese and other dialects talked our way in, helped us get in, and we found out our little girl was fine. But it was scary. But later on, there were studies done of some of the bullet markings in the apartments, and it became pretty clear it was the PLA firing directly into those buildings, perhaps because foreigners were there, and many of them would get out on their balconies, particularly journalists who were watching what was happening in the street below. Anyway, after that, I became very familiar with this entrance because that was the U.S. ambassador's residence, and behind that was the building where we kept Fang Lijie, the astrophysicist, and his wife, Li Shuxian, who were hiding in our embassy. This was a TV screen grab when they were being hunted. This was a photograph I took of them when they were in this little apartment we created for them. And when I met with them for 13 months, 3 evenings a week, and every weekend, 1 afternoon. And we would arrange it. And I would brief them on recent developments in negotiating their case, offers that have been made, and I would also just brief them on what was going on with the U.S. government and what was going on in Beijing, as near as we could tell. It was that time that the only time I never thought, because I was opposed to the Vietnam War too, that I would shake hands with Richard Nixon. But he met with Li Peng, and at that time there was a rumor that we were going to try to smuggle around Halloween, around this time of year, we were going to smuggle Fang and his wife out because everybody in the embassy was going to wear Fang Lijie masks, and then they wouldn't be able to tell who it was. And so they put PLA troops every yard, every meter, with submachine guns all around the embassy. And Nixon heard about that, and he said to Li Peng, you know, I'm going to go to the embassy tomorrow, and I understand it's surrounded by troops. And I'm telling you this now, if I go there and that's true, he said, then I'm going to leave immediately. I'm not going to go inside the embassy, and I'm going to go to the airport, and I'm going to hold a press conference, and I'm going to tell people why I left. And the next morning, the troops were gone. They were just the normal police. So I shook his hand. I flew with him. This is me getting on it was one of the planes used for the vice president. This is Fang and his wife. This was Ambassador Lilly at the time. I helped prepare a statement for him. The agreement was that we wouldn't go to the U.S. right away. They would go to England. And so I delivered them to the Foreign Office, and then I flew back to Beijing, so I went around the world in 3 days. Here in one of his books, I told him to write in English so I could show it to my friends and they would understand it. I'm very proud of that. Our most close friend at the hard time of our lives. And so lessons learned, well, for me, the lesson was that the most troubling aspect of China was often how the government treats its own people. And I also realized at that point I needed a break from constant stress and hard work. To this day, when I get a phone call late at night, I sometimes think I wake up, I think something terrible has happened. I got some senior training at Stanford for about 10 months. I was working on editing the English text of his memoirs, but I realized, because my Chinese was better, that there were a lot of mistakes in the text because I was looking at the English, I was looking at the Chinese, and I told the publisher, I think this translation needs work. They showed it to a really good professional translator, and he said, yeah, it's not accurate. I gave a lot of talks because I was ordered to by Washington, supporting U.S. policy in the Middle East, but also in the Foreign Service and U.S. policy in general. The most important thing I did probably is I worked on the chapter of George Shultz's book, his memoirs, Turmoil and Triumph, the chapter on China, which is why in the inner page he thanked me for all of my help. There was a little bit more than help, and that's why also in the acknowledgments, this is my biggest claim to fame, along with Henry Kissinger and other famous American diplomats, I mentioned Bill Stanton. So, and this is me with my second baby daughter who was born at Stanford. That was one of the reasons we went there. First one in Taiwan, second one in Stanford. And that was George Shultz, the Secretary of State. And I went off to, partly because it was a good job for my wife, I was a political military affairs officer in Pakistan. This is the embassy that in 1979 had been burned to the ground by Pakistani students based on a rumor that we had attacked one of the holy sites and set it on fire, which was not true. I was basically in charge of trying to get the Pakistanis not to commit terrorist acts in Kashmir, the area in the northeast that borders India, but is divided between Pakistan and India. And also, to stop building a nuclear weapon, which they always denied they were doing. And of course, sure enough, as we well knew from a lot of intelligence reports, they were building a nuclear weapon. And finally, in 1998, they set off several explosions in those granite hills. They also had always denied supporting terrorism. This is the line of control that separates the Pakistani controlled area from the Indian. And these are the areas that China grabbed when it invaded India back in 62, I guess it was. And this is the area, the Siachen Glacier, that is right here in the corner, that's always fought over. Mostly people die of hypothermia, because it's so cold up there, more than that. And just another example of Pakistan, my wife had a secretary, his daughter had returned. They returned to Pakistan after they'd been evacuated so she could graduate with her friends from the international high school. She was about to go to college, and a couple of people went by the church, opened the door, and tossed grenades in, and they killed her daughter, wounded their son, and only her husband was uninjured. So, lesson learned, my own view is that when people talk about the dangers of ISIS and all, right now I still believe that the combination of nuclear weapons and the extremism, religious extremism in Pakistan, means that Pakistan remains probably the most dangerous country in the world. And I also learned that even those who are responsible for imposing Islamic law on others and writing rapidly anti-American commentaries want to drink scotch in your home, they send their children to American universities and they have green cards. So there's an awful lot of hypocrisy among the elite there. I returned to work in a high-level policy office. The number 3 guy in the State Department is the Undersecretary of Political Affairs, and I was his assistant for Asia. And the most compelling, memorable experience of that time, I worked a lot on the Korean issue, was when we flew in. He himself wanted and took me along as his note-taker. We flew into Seoul. We were picked up at the civilian airport by 3 military helicopters. He was the 4-star general in charge of not only U.S. but also UN troops in Korea, and therefore also of Korean troops. And we flew at dusk along the Han River as we were going to his camp. And he described what would happen in the event of a war down below, and how the saboteurs would break out, and how they would cause fires, and how shelling would happen, and about the infiltrators who would be wearing South Korean uniforms, and how many people they would kill to confuse the South Korean troops and make the public distrustful of them. And he said, I'm not saying we won't win, we will win. But I'm telling you right now, if you're really set on taking action, you better send in tens of thousands more troops before you do it. And I'm telling you now that tens upon tens of thousands of people are going to die. And afterwards, they decided, I guess, to try diplomacy. So my mantra always is, particularly if you're a diplomat, think carefully before you take military action. Okay? And I was convinced at that time, and still am, there's no good military solution for the North Korean nuclear threat. That doesn't mean I necessarily think there's a diplomatic solution either, but there's no good military solution. There's no solution that doesn't mean lots of people are going to die. I then moved on. I was the deputy director of Chinese affairs. It was during a tough time because Lee Kuan Yew made his famous speech at Cornell. They got people so upset. And Chinese basically cut off relations, really scared the White House a lot. And, I also was working at that time on the WTO issue, not the WTO, the most favored nation trading status, which means to treat China like any other country. And what I learned in the battle over Lee Kuan Yew, but also over the human rights issue, because that was the counter-argument to we need to do more business, we got to give the most favored trading status. I learned that big business would beat human rights advocates in the battle over what policy to have every day. It's only in recent years when people realized that it wasn't such a great business deal necessarily for the US, particularly with the revulsion against free trade, which resulted also in the election of Trump. During that time, then, I went on from there to become the political counselor in Beijing. I thought I would never go back, but I did because it was too good an opportunity. That was the time when the Chinese fired missiles over Taiwan. It was also when Hillary Clinton, as First Lady, participated in the UN Women's Conference. We helped to get Wei Jingsheng. In those days, it was easier if we had a high-level visitor coming to get people released. We got him released and brought him to the airport. Chinese thinking had changed. By that time, they wanted him to get on a commercial jet. Deng Xiaoping died at that time. And we also then prepared for Johnson's visit to the US, and then for the return visit of Clinton in '98, which in some ways was very unfortunate because the negotiations for that visit, he committed to doing things like to work toward building a constructive strategic relationship with China. And to achieve that end, he also publicly stated that the US would not support Taiwan's participation in any international organization for which statehood was a requirement, which is a violation of the Taiwan Relations Act, which says nothing in this act shall take away the ability of Taiwan to participate in international organizations. So from a US point of view, and from a Taiwan point of view, it was not a very good visit. This is where they fired missiles here, and where else? And over here. And lessons learned, my view, I give a talk sometimes on the failures of US policy in China. is by allowing them to make money, helping them to prosper, and while acknowledging that there was more personal freedom than ever. There really was no political freedom or rule of law, and they remained unlikely. And I believe and continue to believe the Chinese Communist Party will ever do whatever is necessary to maintain its rule. We'll see more of that next week with the 19th Party Congress, which opens, I think, on Tuesday. And many in the U.S. government and the U.S. business community, other countries as well, incorrectly continue to believe that China was evolving necessarily in a positive direction. So I was around for a lot of the high-level visits. Here he is. Remember before he took office, he said we had to crack down on the butchers of Beijing. Well, here's one of them, Li Peng, and their clinking glasses, Jiang Zemin. So every U.S. president, no matter how rhetorically tough about China at the start of the administration, winds up toasting the Chinese in the end. We may see that in November, if as reported, we see Trump going to China. He started out before he was elected being very tough. He's not so tough anymore. And here I've got photographs of all the presidents hugging, or not kissing, I guess, but hugging or clinking glasses. Continuing major strategic goal of U.S. policy toward the PRC for most U.S. governments since President Nixon was to separate China from the Soviet Union and Russia. The policy was based on that premise has been a complete failure. China and Russia are closer than they've ever been, certainly as a military alliance. As necessary and inevitable as normalization with relations was, we have to recognize it strengthened China and enabled China to ally more closely with Russia. After the visit of Bill Clinton, I told our ambassador, who we see here besides behind the destroyed door, the front of the U.S. Embassy, Jim Sasser, he has said the White House is asking me to stay another year. I said, look, if you look at the history of U.S.-China relations, they go up and they go down. We're at a high now. It's never going to stay this good. And sure enough, before he left, we bombed by mistake, NATO forces anyway, bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and this was the response. The students and demonstrators were let loose on the U.S. embassy. So the lesson I learned from that is timing, of course, is everything. You should have listened to me about getting out of there. I went to the senior seminar where it was basically refamiliarized myself with America, but I taught for a couple of weeks at an African American women's college for 2 weeks, tried to recruit people for the Foreign Service. I got to go to visit many U.S. bases and sit in an F-16, although I didn't fly one, I gotta say. I was offered a ride, but I was too chicken. But periodic training, no matter what you do, especially exposure to new experiences, areas of knowledge, is important for personal and professional development. I was then director of UN Political Affairs during a difficult time because we had conservative Senator Helms who would cut off our payments to the UN because he thought our payments were too high. We hadn't paid our assessments. There was pressure to reform the Security Council, which was unlikely ever to happen, because while we had favored candidates, the Chinese or the Russians wouldn't accept any of them. So there were a lot of conflicts, as there always are at the UN. And the lesson I learned from those 2 years is the UN is never any better than its members. We got to remember, for example, that in 2011, the UN General Assembly, which is the largest body, all the countries participate in the UN General Assembly, they called for a moment of silence in honor of Kim Il-sung following his death. So, they're not exactly Democrats and human rights activists in the General Assembly. The Security Council remains unbalanced and unrepresentative. America, France, and England, and Russia are all arguably European, but we were mainly there because we were allies at the end of World War II. And then there's China, which unfortunately replaced the Republic of China. And there's no representation at all for Africa, for Latin America, For Eastern Europe, it's problematic. You can see here is U.S. still pays the largest amount for peacekeeping, 28%. And actually, if you look at it, it's only 5 countries, all members of the Security Council, that actually pay a combined 80% of the cost of peacekeeping. The assessed contributions to the UN regular budget, again, the 5 members of the Security Council pay almost 69%, and the U.S. pays the largest amount, 22%. I was then director of Egypt North American Affairs. Here I am taking notes at the meeting with Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, Colin Powell, and this was David Welsh, our assistant secretary, and this was Bill Burns, who later was Deputy Secretary of State. Biggest issue I worked on were the negotiations to get payment for all the families of the victims of Pan Am 103 that the Libyans blew up. There were 270 families. I had to meet with those families just like I did with the Lebanon hostage families. One of the things is that there were people at that time, when we were doing these negotiations, it was quite clear the Libyans wanted to get in our good graces. And ultimately, our negotiations led to their giving up their weapons of mass destruction and their nuclear materials. But some of the people in Washington, he was the number 3 guy in the Department of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, smart guy. Also, this is, he was later the UN, it was before he was the UN representative of the United States to the UN, John Bolton. They said we should stop those negotiations because Libya was part of the axis of evil. And so, my lesson there is you have to try diplomacy first because sometimes it works. I would argue that getting Libya to give up all of its weapons of mass destruction was actually the biggest success of George W. Bush's administration. And it was something a lot of the neocons, as they were called, the neoconservatives, totally opposed. I was also involved in this little one. It's kind of more humorous than anything. There's a little rock that sits off the coast of Morocco that Spain claims, and one day the Moroccans put some troops on it, and it led to a crisis. I tell you that because in his book, The Post-American World, Fareed Zakaria, who's on CNN every Sunday, he quotes Colin Powell in saying, well, like so many cases, the U.S. has to get involved to get the problem solved. So he said, so I sat down and wrote an agreement on my home computer, got the sides to accept it, then signed for each side, and faxed it over to Spain and Morocco. That's all true, except I wrote the agreement. I did it on my home computer, sent it to his office at the State Department, and they sent it to him. He made no changes, he agreed to it, and we sent it on. So the lesson there is if you become a diplomat, don't expect to get the credit for the things you do. I would never say this publicly, by the way, because I like Colin Powell, but a lot of people, the higher they are, the more credit they'll take. Here's me with a picture of Colin Powell, who I really do respect, despite his misjudgment about the Iraq War. My last 9 years, I climbed a better ladder, going to countries which are basically friendly and allies. So I went to Australia, to Canberra, to Seoul, and then finally to Taipei. This is what our embassy looked like. And actually, in Australia, it was smaller than the ambassador's residence. And the design in Australia is all the embassies have to look like traditional architecture of your home country. So they built it to look sort of Mount Vernon-like, or like a southern plantation. And like that, the big house is where the plantation owner sits, the ambassador. And the outhouse, the things along the fence, the smaller quarters, that was for the slaves. That was us. That's where we worked. But the ambassador left because his friend George W. Bush, who was a political appointee, made him ambassador to Japan. And I wound up being for 23 months, the acting ambassador in Australia, which was fun. And during that time, we got a free trade agreement, and there was huge opposition from the Australians. And it's actually the only trade agreement I can think of where, well, it's one of the few where we have a trade surplus with the Australians. We created a special category, visa category, because they supported us in Iraq. George W. Bush wanted to be nice to Prime Minister Howard. So we introduced a visa category just for Australians, for professionals. I managed huge numbers of visits. This is saying goodbye to Condi Rice before she's getting on a plane. We had constant visits. Why? Because Australia is a fun place to visit, so people always come through there. And we have a very close defense relationship, so we were constantly getting 3- and 4-star generals. I learned being a diplomat in a friendly country, contrary to my initial guidance, takes as much effort as working in an unfriendly country, and it sure is nice to work in a friendly country. Then I went to Seoul. Don't be building. You can sure see how much Philippines has fallen behind and how much the Koreans have progressed when I tell you that the engineers who built this building were Filipinos. And the building next door is identical, and that's where the Ministry of Culture is, and we've been trying for the last 40 years to move out of there. And I was the number 2 in the embassy. It was a big embassy, like 575 US Korean employees. We negotiated the Korea-US free trade agreement. We got it signed in 2007, but then everybody had second thoughts, Congress, the Korean National Assembly, and it wasn't implemented to 2012. And despite all the talks I gave about how important this agreement was, actually our trade deficit with the Koreans has gone up tens of billions of dollars since we signed it. So it's no wonder Trump complains about it all the time. We also got South Korea into the visa waiver program. So I was, very proud of that. And we finally also reached an agreement on beef. And if you think the Taiwanese were tough, you have no idea until you see hundreds of thousands of people massing to march on the US Embassy. And they had double-decker buses and they were double-deck containers. And here you see Koreans who are nuts throwing beef manure onto all these shelves in a store, so all the food had to be thrown away. So I learned protectionism is a powerful force in all countries. The Koreans are tough negotiators, but sometimes you can make progress on hard issues. And all allies are not necessarily always friendly, but it also helps and you need to drink a lot in Korea. So, and I did, which was not good for my health either. I came to Taiwan. Great. This is what most people see from the street. This is actually, if you go through to the guest entrance, it's a little bit more presentable. We're much bigger than people realize. We had 140 Americans, 11 government agencies, 375 Taiwanese working there. That included our office in Kaohsiung and our language school. This is me before I went off, shaking the hand of Hillary Clinton. She'd broken her arm before then, but I didn't do it. It shows I learned very quickly about the Taiwan media that you couldn't necessarily trust it. March 2009, they said I'd be controversial because of my history of strong support for Beijing's policies, and that I impeded internal reports critical of the Chinese regime. That was a leak from somebody who had gotten such a bad review from me that he was low ranked and wound up leaving the Foreign Service, and he wound up working on the Hill, and he was very bitter. Then when I was getting ready to leave, they say Stanton was excessively pro-Taiwan, so you can't win. You're either too much or too little. Hard to be just right. I'm most proud I got Taiwan nominated as a candidate for the visa waiver program, although they didn't announce it until 2 months after I was gone. I think that was because maybe they thought I was too pro-Taiwan to begin with. I promoted U.S. trade. We were number 1 or 2 for the 3 years I was in AIT for export successes for American companies. We helped resolve the beef dispute at a time when beef sales were now going up because the Koreans had agreed to the Japanese. There's very strong political opposition, but I would say it was nothing like that I experienced with the Koreans. I was quoted, I guess this comes out of one of the WikiLeaks but I won't deny it. How Long Bing and I met, it wasn't Stephen Young. Stephen Young was long gone. And he told me, or maybe he told him the same thing, that he has a PhD in food safety from the University of Massachusetts. He said, we all know beef is safe. U.S. beef is safe. We all like it. But it's a political issue. He didn't say fake issue. Now that he's in the opposition again, he and Wu Dunyi, who used to say much the same thing, all are opposed to entry of U.S. pork. So it hasn't changed that much. We got the 2 largest arms sales of any 4-year administration. Once I visited virtually all the bases in Taiwan. We increased high-level visits. This was the Deputy Secretary of Energy, who, by the way, was very impressed by the nuclear power plant 2 and the safety measures that Taiwan had taken. This guy was the administrator in charge of the Agency for International Development. He was the Assistant Secretary for International Trade at the Department of Commerce. We had extensive public outreach to talk about how Taiwan had helped America and how America had helped Taiwan, to show that it was a two-way street, that we both gained from the relationship. We finally, when I arrived, we already earlier, 6 months earlier, had a site dedication, but we had never actually gotten any permits to break ground. This is what the new Soweida Dashaguan will look like. That was the initial sketch. It may have changed a little bit. But we got that moving, so that about 6 or 7 months after I arrived, we finally broke ground. This is what the interior looked like, and there's an overhead shot of what it'll look like. And instead of this roadie entrance to the concert section, and we'll go in this way, we also moved from this roadie building, and it was insecure, in Kaohsiung, we moved into an entire floor of the steel building in Kaohsiung. And one of my things I'm most proud of is I said this is an ugly logo for AIT. I think Doug Paul invented it. It looks like AIG, the insurance company. And I said we've got to put America back in the American Institute. So we actually came up with different designs ourselves. And then we went out and talked to Taiwanese and Americans. And we asked them, which do you like the most? Which do you like the least? And which troubles you the least of all of them? And we did a survey and then the results. And this was the most liked and the least disliked. And so that's been our logo ever since. I was also the first and only, now there's been 2 more, but I was the first, but up to that time, the only AIT director who raised the American flag over AIT. And to this day, it still flies. When the former Deputy Secretary of State, Richard Armitage, was visiting, I took him aside and I said, could you have a quiet word with people at the White House? And because it was Republicans then. And tell them we need to raise the flag. He said, you aren't raising the flag? And why I did it, once they put it up, I knew we could never take it down because Congress would never stand for it. Look what they're doing about football players who are kneeling during the Star-Spangled Banner. So it's still up and it'll always be there, I think, until the day we're no longer here, if that ever happens. Taiwan was a great success. The lesson I learned about Taiwan is a great success story, but a story few people know about, both in Taiwan and also outside of Taiwan. Too many people recognize that. Taiwan faces tremendous challenges. The only reason I worry about Taiwan is because sometimes I feel that the Taiwanese don't worry enough about their own country. You're unaware sometimes of all the progress you've made, an economic and political miracle with virtually no natural resources, only human talent. Human skill. Not enough attention was paid to U.S.-Taiwan relations at that time by either Washington or Taipei. That was my view. Nonetheless, progress can be made if you're willing to keep pressing both Washington and Taipei. And I pressed as hard as I could, which is why they were happy for me to leave. In Washington, anyway. I guess Ma was kind of happy I left too. Overall lessons for government officials: history is neutral. Truth and goodness do not necessarily prevail. I think you know that. If it's news to you, I'm sorry to break the bad news. But so many leaders have led to catastrophes that beyond imagination, and so many policies. Just think of our continuing fighting in Iraq and and Afghanistan. Policies and decisions change our lives in every way. This is the complex that was built for the university. I had never finished because in the course of building it, Far Glory added on a shopping center and 2 towers. One is a hotel and one is an apartment building, apparently. Right behind the Guofu Jiningguang, the Sun Yat-sen Memorial Park, the ceremonial building. And what upsets me about that is the 2 mayors who approved it were both KMT representatives. And Sun Yat-sen was one of the founders of the Kuomintang. He was also the first president of the Republic of China. And he's called the father of the Republic, right? And yet you would agree to build this. That would be tantamount in Washington if we put that behind the Lincoln Memorial. You think people would agree to that? I don't think so. They'd say, what are you doing? Are you crazy? But, anything's possible. So, policies therefore matter on issues large and small. They can and do change the direction and the nature of our future world. Government officials therefore also matter in shaping those policies and in how they implement them. So you can make a difference and you always have to try. And finally, if you work in government, it is critical that you honestly express your views. I always did. Sometimes that meant I didn't get the job I wanted. But it's just as important that you always publicly at least support the government's policies once they are decided, or if you cannot, get reassigned or resign. Those are the choices. Therefore, we all have a responsibility to find and work hard to support and implement policies that will make our societies and the world in which we live better. And so all of you as the future leaders, and many of you, the future leaders of Taiwan, you have a responsibility for Taiwan. So to the extent my stories help you think about that, and I will have succeeded a little bit. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I talked too much. Went over 10 minutes over. People haven't any. They probably want to go home. But maybe it's still raining, so they'd rather stay here.
There are many stories that in the 80s I was in the United States to study, to watch TV on this kind of things. And then after I got my degree, I worked in the California. And at that time in the evening, we were watching the Tiananmen massacre and all these things. And then I moved back to Taiwan, and all these interesting stories, really so vivid and it's touching. But I really appreciate the final advice you give to students. And if anyone wants to have some questions and
thank you very much. I'm from the Department of History, and I want to ask whether diplomats and diplomatic efforts can be displaced or controlled by artificial intelligence in the future. Thank you.
Will this work? I kind of doubt it because, one of the important jobs with a diplomat is to convey your government's views. But a lot of how you convey it, the manner in which you convey it, the politeness with which you convey it, is also important. A computer can say the words. But also, your job is not only to deliver a message, but it's also to get an answer. And when you get an answer, I don't think, maybe they'll become sophisticated enough, but pick up nuances in what people say and signals of what they mean. And, go away with a sense of whether they'll support you, or most likely when I was in Beijing, not support you. I think, building good relations is what being a diplomat is about, and trying to improve relations and trying to solve problems together. And I think those are pretty highly developed intellectual skills that I don't think are easily replaceable by AI. I mean, I know computers can win at Go and at chess, but that's because it's within a closed system. And when you're a diplomat, you draw on all your experience, both before being a diplomat and as a diplomat, and all of your knowledge and other contacts, and you integrate what you hear from one person with what you've heard from another. And then you sit down often and you synthesize what you've heard. All of those skills, I think, are fundamentally unique to human intelligence, but maybe I'm wrong about that. I know it's becoming more and more advanced, but at this stage of the game, I just don't see AI doing that. There are one of the things that's changed about diplomacy is that everybody thinks they can be a diplomat now, because you can tweet a message, because the president can pick up a phone and talk to somebody. Digital technology means that everybody in Washington, for example, or everybody in Taiwan, everybody in Taipei, in the government, thinks they're an expert on every issue because they saw it in the news. They read about it. They just talked to somebody, so they know better. But often what they see and what they know is very partial, And so I think that would be also true of AI, If you just want to deliver messages, you don't even need AI. Somebody could record something into a microphone and you could get over there. But also you don't really understand the country till you live there. And machines don't live. They don't experience life and emotions and get a sense of what the people are like. I mean, I meet people all the time who come to Taiwan for the first time, and they really like it. And they didn't even know anything about it. But they come here and they have a whole different impression of it, because they meet the people and they talk to colleagues, and it's an opening for them, an enlightenment for them. Machines aren't going to do that, I don't think.
Thank you, Dr. Sin, for sharing your story.
You can call me Bill. You're a Fulbrighter. You can all call me Bill.
So I have two questions. First, given that Taiwan recently is the political allies globally of Taiwan are diminishing, do you think that there's any wiggle room for the United States to maybe step up its support for Taiwan going forward? The second question is, under the current administration, the United States is seen as abdicating its role of global leadership. Do you think that this is a temporary phenomenon, or one that maybe will have longer repercussions?
Yeah. Well, they're both great questions. I don't think Taiwan's formal diplomatic relations are that important. They're mostly small, developing countries who Taiwan can do more for them than they can do for Taiwan. I would prefer to see Taiwan putting more time and energy and personnel into its informal diplomatic relations with the United States, with Japan, with Indonesia, with India, with Germany, with France, with key economic and political military countries to have a better relationship. Now, some countries it's going to be hard to do more, but in general, I think Taiwan doesn't try hard enough to do that, to put more money and more effort into these normal relationships. It also needs to try harder. America's been very supportive, but China has basically bought up all the international organizations. If you read, there's recently been reports about how much Chinese money goes in aid to countries that vote with it in the UN. It's a key factor in China's decision-making about aid. Not how badly a country needs it, but how supportive are those countries politically. That's why also you get votes for Kim Il-sung in the General Assembly. Well, also, they very carefully, as a permanent member of the Security Council, put key people in. For example, it was a Chinese national or Hong Kong national who was in charge of the World Health Organization, who was in charge of the International Civil Aviation Organization, or Aeronautical Organization, or the ICAO. So it's tough to go up against that. But I think Taiwan can do more through business, through culture, through contacts, through educational exchanges, and through informal diplomacy. Put more of your people in the United States and work more on Capitol Hill, and to be talking to the administration. Those are the things I've advocated. I can't tell, my talks when I'm asked what's going to happen in Washington can't tell because, I have a very low opinion of President Trump. He's erratic, he's unpredictable, or he's predictably very bad in what he says and does. I worry a lot about America in the future and what it's going to do, and the fact that it is abdicated an important role. I thought particularly I was upset when we withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because I thought that was necessary both economically and geostrategically for the US to keep involved in Asia. And Trump doesn't seem to be aware of any of that. Our alliances with Japan and Korea are vital. Actually, our informal alliance with Taiwan is very much alive. We have regular, you couldn't imagine the number of military and defense officials who come to Taiwan on an annual basis. And they're trying constantly to find ways to grow that part of the relationship, but also to encourage more visits of all kinds. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think there are things we can still do even in the face of President Trump. But it's getting more difficult. And the State Department's role is much diminished. I mean, he's constantly criticizing now his Secretary of State. So, I'm very worried what he will do, just as I was worried about Mar-a-Lago when he visits with Xi Jinping. What's he going to say? What's he going to do while he's there? Those are all worrisome.
Thank you.
Somebody back there.
Hello. Thank you. I'd like to ask, is there an exam you took if you want to be a diplomat in US, and is it tough? And regarding the language programs, is there a requirement for example, ambassadors to Japan will be required with Japanese proficiency in your diplomatic circle? Finally, I'd like to ask, as a diplomat, why did you decide to shave your mustache?
Well, the last one first. The reason I grew a mustache is I always looked very young. And here I was dealing with people usually who are older than me. So I decided that if I grew a mustache, I'd be more scary. I'd be older looking. And that sort of worked. And then I shaved it with one day when my teenage daughter, or my older daughter, said, "Dad, it looks terrible, get rid of it." So, I probably had it too long. But it sort of worked, particularly when I was in China, because in general, if you have a mustache, all the villains in Hong Kong movies have mustaches off their head. So, yes, there is an exam. There are actually there are two exams. There have always been two. There's first a written exam, which over the years has gotten shorter and easier. When I took it, it was about 5.5 hours long. And it was very hard. And what they found was, and then the oral exam was a 3-hour interview with 3 Foreign Service officers. And what they found was they were getting a lot of people who did well taking exams, but weren't necessarily very good at interpersonal skills. So they created an oral exam that was most of a day, and it would judge you on other characteristics. For example, there's a fake negotiation. You sit down with other candidates, and you're given a problem to negotiate or to solve or whatever. And then they monitor it. Is there somebody who hogs all the talking? Is there somebody who doesn't talk at all? Is there somebody who tries to bring in a solution that satisfies both sides? Is there somebody who brings relevant information to the discussion? And they grade you on that. Then there's another exam, they may have changed it now, that they give an inbox exam. And they give you 10 problems on pieces of paper. I know, one is there's a fire in the basement of the embassy. The second one is the son of your political counselor has just been arrested for smoking marijuana. The third one is you've gotten a report that a revolution is breaking out in a province. And all these problems. And then they say, prioritize all these problems that you've been given, and then briefly describe what you would first do to solve each of them. There's also then more of a written essay. There was also a written essay in the previous one. That's another part of it. But the whole thing is to see how people interact with one another. Now, I have to say, I've seen people come in under the old system and the new system. And, you get winners and losers under both, actually. This third point on language, they give you extra points if you know a language. I mean, I scored, and they give you an aptitude for language. I scored high on aptitude. I had spoken German. I lived a year in Germany, which was kind of silly to give me credit for that because I never went back to Germany. And to answer your question, some of the most important posts in the world almost never get career officers. That's one problem with the US system. About 35% of all of our ambassadors, mostly to important countries, are political appointees. So they don't have any language skills at all. Sometimes they don't even speak English well. I mean, we never anymore there's only been one in the last 35 years in China. We've had one political appointee here in Taiwan. We get the people who go as ambassador to Korea never speak, to Japan, never speak Japanese. Same for Australians, they all speak English. New Zealand always gets a political appointee, as does Australia, almost always. And then even within the system, there are people, for example, who've never served a day in Asia, but they'll bid on a position in the Philippines. They've only served, say, in Africa, but they'll wind up going to the Philippines because they're close to the Secretary of State. So there's a lot of political maneuvering on assignments. But in recent years, they give much more credit to people if they're already fluent, particularly in a hard language: Arabic, Korean, Russian, Chinese, Japanese. If you have one of those 5 languages, you have added strength. But I have to say that one of the worst officers I ever met was fluent in Japanese, Chinese, French, Portuguese, and had a good bit of Korean. And he was a terrible officer. He was partly a great linguist because he was able to go out and meet people, and he was a drummer. So he would join local bands, and he would spend all of his time hanging out with people as a drummer and learning to speak to people. That's all he did. But when he got to a post, he continued to do the same thing. And of course, they would say, well, what cable did you write this week? You're supposed to do one like every day. And he wouldn't have even done one in 2 weeks. So you can't tell. I don't think there's any perfect system for predicting how well a particular individual will do in a particular job. But it's a good question. It's something to think about.
And how does the experience of studying literature influence your life as a diplomat? And if you had a chance to travel in time, would you still make the same decision to study literature?
I think so, because, I mean, I've read now an awful lot about international relations. I did at that time anyway, I'd already done that. And economics, and I don't find them all that interesting. I mean, I knew them well enough to pass the exam, but there are a lot of things about them that I don't find as interesting. But that's maybe just because of my own preference. I was a science honors major in high school, and all it did was convince me that I didn't want to do calculus. I didn't want to do differential equations or whatever. I didn't want to do any of those things. But the one thing literature does, and I've talked to the provost about this, is the great thing about the humanities is, I think, particularly literature, is it gives you empathy for other people. And because what literature does is two things. One is you can see in different cultures, if you read a novel, how thoughts are different, family relationships may be different. But all literature also teaches you the commonalities of the human experience. Because all literature talks about human emotions, human feelings. And so it makes you understand other people better. Now, not only I say that, but I give the example of Walter Eisner. He was the head of Disney Productions for like 13 years, 14 years. And he said he never took a business course in his life. He said, all I did was study literature. And he said, my sons are in college now, and all I want them to do is study literature because it helps you understand other people. So, you know, maybe he overemphasizes it. But there are a lot of people who've been successful. Ted Turner, who created CNN, he studied classics, Latin and Greek literature, and his father, against his father's wishes, he went to Brown University. So I could come and give a lecture about why read literature. And there are scientific studies that have been done that actually creates empathy. But I just think that it also, one of the things is, if you're going to a field that requires writing like a diplomat, there's no better way than to read a lot of literature and to have practice writing. And it's not the kind of writing, we have a lot of lawyers who join the State Department, but being a lawyer doesn't necessarily prepare you well to be a diplomat, because lawyers are so into the minutiae of issues. And most people in Washington, you've got to tell them everything they need to know in a summary paragraph, and even better in the title, because they may not have time to read more than that. So you have to give them the kernel of what they say, and then you give more detail for the record. So I think, you know, writing and studying something like literature helps you write more quickly and better able to communicate. Because I think to this day, most communication still has to be written by most diplomats. You have to have a record. Now, that's disappearing, I understand, under Trump. He doesn't even take note takers sometimes to his meetings. But that's a real mistake, because then you don't know what commitments were made. You don't know. Everybody's flying blind. They have no idea what's been said or what's been done. It's only what he then says after the meeting. It's like when President Ma met with Xi Jinping. And when he met publicly, he said, "一个中国," but he didn't say, "各表示,各表, what's the word? 各表, 一中, 各表." He didn't say different interpretations. So then when he was asked about that, or his staff was, he said that in private. Who knows what he said in private? The only record of it is what the Chinese kept. So it's important. What's important is not what you say publicly. What's important is what's said to you privately. So you need a record of what's being said. That's one of the important jobs of a diplomat. And one of the problems with our age nowadays, the digital factor, is you can talk to anyone, anywhere in the world. You're on a cell phone, even if it's not secure. And maybe your enemy will pick up what you're saying, but there's no record of it. Because important people who are leaders, they don't write down what was said. So nobody knows. So then how does the rest of the government fall behind the leader and follow up on whatever's been said? You can't. So I think there's a lot of reasons literature's not a bad idea. And I wouldn't study anything else just because I enjoy literature more. But, you know, I wouldn't say that everybody should study literature. We need people in a lot of other areas, AI, climate, agricultural economics, all areas of learning are important. But I think sometimes in the modern age, everybody dismisses the humanities too easily.
It's getting late this evening, and I think the Weather Bureau saying there's more torrential rain. But anyway, it's been 2 hours, and I appreciate very much Bill's personal story, and some maybe even legendary. But I think we just have to conclude the night. Before the end, we'd like to present a souvenir to Bill, and then we'll finish this evening's event.
Oh, Bushra. Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for attending this evening. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.